VFX. VFX? What's the deal with VFX? Is this a VFX? If it's called Weta, then why is the floor so dry? And if Chris Nolan is so big, why won't he fight me? All this and more on this episode of In the Comp. Have you ever looked at stock footage of the Pantheon in Rome and thought, man, I bet I can fix that hole in the roof with a little VFX? That's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn about projection mapping in DaVinci Resolve Studio. Yes, I know. I like making tutorials that only involve the free version, but I wanted this out there anyway. I promise to make more free tutorials soon. Now, in our case, we're going to use projection mapping for a little bit of corrective VFX. We just want to remove something from the scene, and we'll assume all other methods weren't working out. First, we'll analyze our footage, we'll track it using the 3D camera tracker, we'll paint out the thing we don't want in the shot, and then we'll project that patch onto 3D geometry we've placed in the scene. Easy stuff, so let's get to it. Alrighty, so as always, our first step, whenever we want to do any match moving, is to analyze our footage and see what's going on. Now, I did do a little work ahead of time. As we can see, there's a bird flying across the middle of the frame. So that's one thing that I went ahead and created a mask for. It's just a really simple ellipse that's just following the path of the bird. And we also have the hole, which I tracked real quick in Mocha. Those lights, I don't know if it would actually mess with the solve, but you know, I decided to get rid of those two because it would also kind of make things a little confusing when we go to select points from the point cloud when we're trying to select around here. You'll see. So I just went ahead and got rid of that too. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll grab a camera tracker. And I always like to track below my nodes. I don't know why. And we'll plug our media in into the input of the camera tracker. And we'll take our masks and we'll plug those into the track mask of the camera tracker. Now I'm going to assume that you have a decent idea of how the camera tracker works. There are like a bajillion tutorials on how to do camera tracking. I am not going to skip any steps, but I'm also not going to go like super in depth into it. So of course I like to turn on to preview the auto track locations, and it looks like it is actually ignoring that. I'm going to give it a few more points to work with. Not too many, otherwise this will go crazy. And enable bidirectional tracking and go. Now this scene is like extremely favorable. I mean, there's very little movement, and the streets of Rome are absolutely dead at the moment. I'm wondering if they shot this during quarantine or something. I don't know. So we're done. Looks like a really rock solid track. And we'll hit solve. When I tried this out before, I got a really crazy solve error of like 0.15 or something like that. I'm going to see if we can do that again. We're at 0.5. Let's see if we can make that even better. We'll lower that solve error and delete. And solve again. Oh, 0.16. Those points are holding on for dear life. I love it. Now, in this case, you know, you can align the scene and do all that sort of stuff, and it's very important, especially here, because it's almost certainly going to think that the image plane is like going across here when it should be like matching the perspective. It's okay. In this case, I think we're okay to ignore just all of this stuff. And we'll go ahead and hit export, so that way we get our 3D goodies here. Let's take a look. Yeah. And that is one of the most stable tracks. I'll tell you, many years ago when I first played around with After Effects, and saw stuff like this with the 3D tracker, I'm like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing ever. And that kind of got me into all this stuff. Anyway, down memory lane. So what we're going to do here is we want to place our patch above here. So there are a couple of points. So I'm just going to grab a few of these. and we're going to right click, go to Point Cloud 3D, and create an image plane. So it's created. It looks pretty good where it is. We're just going to go in here and double check, switch the camera to perspective. We'll kind of look and eyeball it. In this case, we might want 2 views. One that's going to be from the camera's perspective. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to see which points are which. Looks like that one is that one in the front there. It's sitting a little above because it didn't track any points really close to the lip of the hole in the ceiling. So we might have ended up needing to move this plane outward a little. And I think I might actually do that just slightly. So I'm going to grab the image plane. This does not need to be merged or into the point cloud. So we're going to disconnect that image plane and we're going to insert it back into the merge 3D scene there. Just going to move this up a little bit. And what I'm also going to do, so that way this has plenty of room to throw that image onto, we're going to go into here and we're going to scale it. It can only be too small. I mean, if it's blocking your view, it can be too big, but in this case, you can't really make it too big. There we go. Now for this next step, we're gonna kind of work backwards a little bit. Now that we've got our plane set and our 3D solve done, we can work on making a patch. Now there's a couple ways to do this. I am starting at frame 0 as kind of like my de facto reference frame. So whatever frame you want to start at is totally fine. You'll just want to make sure to freeze your patch to that frame. And to do that, and I'll show you how it works. I actually ended up using Photoshop to make this really wild looking thing. Literally one pass of the content aware fill and it made this disaster here. But it almost looks like somebody patched the roof and they just left a bunch of stuff on top. So I liked it. It like told a story of just giving up too soon, or the quarantine hit and they couldn't clean it up. Oh, there's a screenplay for you. Now what we can do, let me get rid of this, is we're going to grab a paint node. Oh, where to go? I'm going to want it up here. And we're going to feed our footage in. Now before that, actually, we'll want a time. I've used time speed and time stretcher. I'm going to use time speed because I'm a little bit more used to it. So if we grab time speed, we should be able to set the speed to 0. Now this is where if you were on like say frame 120, this is where you put 120 in here. Because now if we move forward, yeah, that is totally frozen. And that's exactly what we want. So now we'll make our paint node active again. And you'll want to come up and grab I always use clone multi-stroke. I gotta admit, the paint node is not something that I use a ton because I am weak and I just use Adobe. I use Photoshop for stuff like this, which sucks because Adobe's an a-hole, but it's going to work pretty much the same as in Photoshop as the clone stamp tool. So what we can do, I'm hitting Alt, and that selects an area to sample. I can just click up. And I guess what you could do is like try to close the hole like this. Still gonna look really wild. So I actually had an idea to use a cork. I actually made a 3D cork in Blender, but the problem is the perspective was really wacky on something that was sticking out of the top of the hole. There's definitely a way you can do that. If you wanted to see a tutorial on how to do that, which would involve actually exporting this camera solve data into Blender and then adding objects to it, rendering it out, and then compositing it back together inside of Fusion. If that's something you'd like to see, certainly let me know. dude. I'm going to grab some just craziness here, but you get the idea. That's how you would paint using the paint brush inside of here. And then once you have this, this would then go into our next step, which involves making sure that the plane is the right material and all that. You'd actually then just plug this in. And you'd also want to make a nice little mask. Drop down to merge. Plug this into the foreground and this into the background. And then this into the effect mask. And then we just have our patch. And you'd want to soften the edge a little bit. And then we have this ready to go to be placed into our 3D scene. Now, in my case, I'm just going to use my patch because it's already here and ready to go. I don't like my patch. I bet your patch is a lot nicer. So we'll just kind of put this in timeout up here. And I'm going to bring this down here. Now, the first thing we'll work on is our image plane. So this needs to be what's called a catcher. And in 3D, a catcher is just something that receives something else. So for example, in Blender, you can create what's called a shadow catcher, which will, if you sit it, say, underneath my cork that I made for in here, it'll catch the shadows, it'll render the shadows and nothing else. And in this case, the catcher is going to catch our patch. You'll see, it'll make sense. So we'll go to our image plane 3D and we're going to grab a catcher material. We're going to plug this into the material input. So now you saw our catcher disappear up here. Let's switch this back to camera 3D. So when we plug this in, this will disappear. And that's exactly what we want. So it's still there, it's just waiting for something to be projected onto it. Now the next step is we're going to create a camera that's actually going to project the patch into the scene. So we're going to actually Control C, Control V, or Command C, Command V our 3D camera. And we're going to name it, I'm just going to name it projector. And what we're going to do here is grab the output of our patch and put that into the image input of the projector, quote unquote. Now again, making sure that we're on the frame that we want to start with. So our next step, we're going to make a few changes to our projector here. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that it's unlocked up here at the top. And then we're going to right click and say remove all from translate group. So that's going to be for translation, and then also same for rotation. Remove all from rotate group. So now that camera is frozen in time. Now, something you don't normally see with a camera in here is the projection tab here. So that only shows up because we have something plugged into the image input. Now we're going to click projection. We're going to enable camera projection. And for the projection mode, I'm going to switch it to texture. And now another thing that will end up causing wonky stuff down the road, under image, we're going to deselect enable image plane. Now let's see how we did. We're going to plug that into our Merge 3D. And there's our patch. And we'll play through. That's not too bad. Just so we can get a closer look, I'm going to real quick add a renderer 3D. That we'll have to fix. I think that's the ground plane. But let's take a look here. Now I'm seeing a little bit of sliding. Now what we might need to do to just kind of make this even better is to kind of adjust the height of that image plane. But I mean, honestly, for a shot that is this far away, I mean, it might as well be perfect. Yeah, that's the image plane. Let's turn that. Let's get rid of that. Ground plane. So that's pretty darn cool. Now this can be used for all manner of things. I just recently had a client who needed me to remove some signage on the front of a building, and I was able to do that using this method. And the reason why I didn't use a planar track, which I actually did try at first, is the perspective shift. So it was shot with a drone, and it went, the drone went up and then also changed the angle of the camera. So using something like this, I was able to, I created a patch with the bricks in the same way that we did it here. And then I, just like this, I did a 3D camera solve and projected that back onto the wall. Now, one thing that we're not running into here that you will almost always run into with camera projection, and we would run into it if this went any further, is you'll get changes in exposure and that. So you might need to come in and at this point where your patches, add like a color correction node, and then we always predivide post multiply, and you might need to come in and mess with the contrast or the lift or the gain and kind of keyframe those as the light changes over time, just to make sure that it matches all the way through. But this is used for all sorts of things. It's used for so many things I can't even think of a specific one. You could have used this technique for that. I think it was our last tutorial about the Miss Marvel wall animations. You could 3D track a scene and then create geometry that matches the buildings and then project the animations that way. It's probably a really roundabout and weird way of doing it. But anytime that you have perspective changes and things like that, using this 3D projection can really, really help. So if you need to remove something in a scene where your camera is actually moving through 3D space, this is how you're going to have to do it. And you could have dozens and dozens of these image planes all over your scene. So if you have multiple fixes that you needed to do, if you wanted to remove all of these little things up top here, you would just create separate patches, put the geometry where it should be, and then they would be gone. Because a lot of VFX is not explosions and big final boss fights and CGI craziness. A lot of it is invisible. It's stuff like this, which is super important, but doesn't always get the same amount of praise. Sometimes you'll end up needing to fix onset mistakes, and this is just another tool in your toolbox. And just to kind of go over it one more time, just in the fast mode, we 3D tracked our scene, we solved it, ended up with a crazy good solve error, and then we exported that 3D scene. We made sure we had our patch. You could do that in Photoshop. Oh, just a quick tip with that. Don't be a dummy like me and crop after you've made a patch in Photoshop. Leave the resolution the same because, then your patch will be exactly in the right place and you won't have to move it around like a dummy, like I did for this for some reason, even though I never do that. So yeah, we have our patch that's put into a second camera that's projecting it onto this image plane, which is catching that projection. Wild stuff. It's actually not that hard. There's, a couple more steps than most things, but that's it. But anyway, if you have any other questions, let me know in the comments. This has been Chris from Swatera Media, and I hope you have a great day.